Everyone, welcome to Uplift. My name is Kyle. I'm so glad that you're here. We're in a series called The Big Questions, and I want to start with a disclaimer. I've done it the past two messages. We're going to do it again as we kind of wrap this series up in a couple of weeks. But here's the disclaimer. There's no need to be afraid of big questions. Big questions are not the enemies of faith. In fact, I think Jesus expects our big questions. I want to read to you from Matthew chapter 22. Listen to his words. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and there's this one, with all your mind. Loving God with all of your mind means some intellectual engagement. In fact, intellect shouldn't be diminished in worship. God invites all of you, your whole self, including your reason, your questions, big or small, they're not unwelcome. In fact, I think believing in God, believing in the person of Jesus is beyond reason, but it's never absent of reason. There are mysteries here. Miracles are mysteries. Belief in God isn't pretending to have no questions. It's trusting God even with your questions. There's my disclaimer. Let's jump in. Culture, I think, seems to prefer an abstract God, but those of us who follow Jesus, we prefer to speak of something really specific, and it's this, that in the person of Jesus, God became a human. He walked dusty roads. He touched blind eyes. He wept over friends. He rose from the dead. These are specific things. He has not died again. He still lives. He lives forever. In fact, when we talk about Jesus, we ask people to find a human God. That's what we're asking. We don't lead people to some diffuse definition of purpose and meaning. We lead people to a man, something really specific. In fact, Jesus doesn't want us to just find our truth. We've heard that phrase a lot, but he wants us to find the truth. I want you to listen to his words in the Gospel of John. You know this. In John 14, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. These are specific words, specific claims. No one comes to the Father, Jesus said, except through me. This Jesus, our God, is unlike any other God. He's not abstract. He made a specific claim. He is unlike any other God of any other stories, of any other religions that claim to have gods who became human. He's not like any of them. I think this specificity leads to the big question we're going to answer here, and this big question is this: why Jesus? Why is Jesus special? Why do we need Jesus? What's the purpose of Jesus? And really the question that we're going to present here for this message is he unique? Is Jesus really special? So we're going to answer that question in a couple of parts. First, I want to show you how Jesus is unique, and I'm going to throw a big word here. I'm going to try not to hurt myself. I want to show you how Jesus is unique ontologically. Now, that's a big word, I know, but I like it. In other words, I want us to explore Jesus' unique identity, his essential nature, which is different from everyone else's. He's the only person to have claimed to be God and to have proved it by walking out of his grave. In other words, I want to show you Jesus in his own words, And second, in a few minutes, I'm going to help us learn to speak of Jesus in a very pluralistic world. I want to show you Jesus in his own world. Pluralism, that's another big word. I can barely even say it. 2 for 2 big words, right? Lots of opinions about who to follow. We need to be able to talk about Jesus in such a world. So first, let's jump right in. Who did Jesus claim to be in his own words? So I want us to think seriously, and I want us to think biblically about the uniqueness of Jesus, not just as an idea and not just as doctrine on a page. And to do that, we're going to have to start with the Gospels, how the Gospels present Jesus. So let's just do some basic 101 here. We have 4 Gospels. We have 4 stories, 4 portraits of Jesus. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke are often called the synoptics because they see similarly. They see together. They present a similar story of Jesus. The synoptic Gospels, and I like this, they tell the story of Jesus from the earth up, right? And then the Gospel of John sees and presents Jesus in a different way. It presents the story of Jesus from heaven down, right? So the synoptics are Jesus from the earth up, and the Gospel of John is Jesus from heaven down. Let me kind of explain what I mean here. So let's go through these. The Gospel of Matthew, it begins with a genealogy. It's a baby born in a scandal, a family line that is seemingly more fragile than divine until you do a little investigation, right? The Gospel of Luke, the second one in our New Testament, opens with songs and shepherds and a poor young woman singing with some strength that the world underestimates. Then you move to the Gospel of Mark. It skips the birth altogether and opens on a wild prophet in the desert crying, "Prepare the way of the Lord." These three Gospels show Jesus in sandals, not just on a throne. They let him walk through towns. They see him getting dust on his feet. They see him speak with authority that confounds even his enemies. They want you to watch as people slowly and tentatively start to grasp who Jesus is. And that's generally how these three Gospels portray Jesus. The Gospel of John, a little different. It skips the build, and it starts right here in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John, the writer of this Gospel, wrote like someone who had years to reflect, right? Someone who knew the ending, and he couldn't wait to tell you about the beginning from that perspective. So you've got these four books, these four Gospels, and they show us the portrait of what happens when people meet Jesus for the first time. Let me walk you through a few of these stories. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, let's start there. We find the healing of a paralyzed man. You know, the story is lowered through a roof by his friends. They were all eager for an encounter with Jesus, and they were so eager for that encounter, they destroyed someone's ceiling. So the man is there. Jesus sees him. The first thing he says to the man is this: "Your sins are forgiven." That's an odd opening. It's not what anyone expected either, by the way, because this man obviously came for healing, but Jesus went deeper. He reached for what couldn't be seen. And of course, the scribes gasped, and they said, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" That's in verse 7. That's not a surprising question, by the way. They get a bad rap. Jesus made a certain claim there that only God can make. And so that no one would miss the point, Jesus eventually physically healed this man. Now, a couple of chapters later in the Gospel of Mark, we find the disciples. A lot of them are fishermen. They're on a boat. They're being tossed like toys in the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was with them. He's asleep on a cushion. The winds are raging. The boat may sink. And then Jesus wakes up, stands up, and he says, "Peace, be still," right? Mark chapter 4, verse 39. And the sea fell flat. And the disciples with Jesus asked the right question. In verse 41 of Mark chapter 4, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" These questions are big. Who is this? Who can forgive sins but God alone? These are the questions that the Gospels answer. And they don't just tell you that Jesus is God, they show you. They show claims of divinity. They show his death and his miraculous resurrection. And they present the resurrection of Jesus, a completely foreign ideal in the world of pagan religions, with unashamed clarity. I want to read you a quote in a minute or two by an author, T.N.D. Mettinger. In his book, The Riddle of the Resurrection, it was actually quoted in a book by Lee Strobel. Mettinger is a widely respected scholar, and he was investigating the claims of other religions that had resurrecting gods. He compiled all of this information, and he began to look at what these other religions were saying about their gods. And he concluded in his book that the scholarly consensus is nearly universal in saying that the myths of dying and rising gods all post-date the 1st century. In other words, they all come after Jesus. In other words, there may be religions with gods that claim to have died and resurrect, but they were all written after the stories of Jesus, after the New Testament. Mettinger ultimately declared in his book this is what he wrote: "As far as I'm aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and the resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct drawing on the myths and the rites of dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. The death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. In fact, we're going to talk more about this next week when we talk about the resurrection. Jesus talked about his death and resurrection in ways that no one ever did. He made claims that no one had ever made. He mentioned not only the fact that he would endure both, but that he would endure both for a specific reason. It gets a little deeper. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus said that he would die to become a ransom for many. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus said that he would die and resurrect to fulfill God's redemptive plan for the world. His death, according to his own words in Matthew 26, was to forgive sin. And in John chapter 11, Jesus said that his death and resurrection guarantees our victory over death. These are specific. The Gospels tell this story, and no other religion had any kind of God that made these kind of claims. None in the history of the world. This is Jesus in his own words. No other God makes these claims. Tim Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, you probably read this one, he told the story of a woman who visited his church in Manhattan, and she wasn't a believer. It's a famous story. I've heard it a couple of times. But he remarked in the book that she was sharp and she was educated, but she kept coming back. She kept coming back to church. So after a few weeks in a conversation, she said to Keller, I think I finally understand what Christianity is. So Keller asked her what she meant, and this is what she said. He puts this quote in the book. This is what she said. I finally gotten what Christianity is all about. I always thought that the difference between religions was just a matter of different rules and emphasis, but I see it's much deeper than that. I thought all religion was basically if I obey, then I am accepted, but Christianity is different. She said, I am accepted, therefore I obey. And this woman, she didn't come to this realization because someone exhausted her with theology or doctrine. She arrived because someone walked her through the story of Jesus as he talked about himself, as others talked about him. All of these in the Gospels. Because Jesus is presented as specific. He's not abstract. He's not the embodiment of philosophical meanderings. He is living and he is truth. So here's just kind of what I want to say to you. You don't have to make Jesus compelling. You don't have to make him relevant. He already is. He is absolutely unique in his own words. But I want to show you his uniqueness in another way. And this is Jesus in his own world. And his world is incredibly pluralistic. Now let me define that for you for just a minute. A pluralistic world refers to a society or a context in which multiple beliefs and values and cultures coexist. I want to show you something. I want to show you a graphic. Now, this graphic comes from the Pew Research Center. Now I'm going to kind of translate this for you. I know some of the writing is kind of small, but at the top you're going to see a blue line. And you're going to see it kind of go down, right? This blue line is the percentage of people who self-identify as Christians in our culture. Now, as it goes down to the very end, to the far right of the graphic, that's 2025, which means that right about now, 60% of Americans self-identify as Christians. You can already see where I'm going with this, right? At the bottom, you're going to see a red line. And this red line, it's a big growing number. These are the people who claim to be religiously unaffiliated in our culture. Kind of what researchers call the nuns. By the time it gets to 2025, that's a full 30% of Americans. So, this is where we are, but go all the way to the far left of this graphic. This data actually begins in 1970, a couple of generations ago. The number of people who claim to be religiously unaffiliated was around 6 or 7%. So from there to 2025, you can see how massive this shift has been. It's increasingly difficult to talk about Jesus to people because right now in America, 1 out of every 3 people have no idea who Jesus is. They have no heritage. They have no faith. They have no means of understanding the terms we use like salvation or holiness or crucifixion. So when we talk about Jesus, there's a wall there. We're often in the business of creating categories for people they don't currently have. But this is a big one. This should not frighten you. And here's why. I want to take you to a city called Thessalonica, and we're going to pop right in the middle of the first century. Now, you know this. The Apostle Paul visits this city, and we actually have his story in Acts chapter 17. And when he goes to Thessalonica, he finds this city thick with pagan gods. In fact, everything I'm about to tell you is attested by archaeological excavations. So in the first century, there was a man named Philip of Thessalonica, and he wrote a lot of stuff, right? And he listed that in his city, there were more than 20 deities, 20 gods that people prayed to. Artemis was used to invoke the healing of the emperor. Artemis in Thessalonica, archaeology attests to this, was credited with restoring sight to a woman. Apollo was called upon by sailors who poured out wine and asked for winds in the name of Apollo to carry them home. We know that a woman dedicated a statue of Aphrodite in hope of finding a good husband. All this is attested. Worship of these gods, all 20 of them, and all the archaeological record was all transactional. You give a goat in the name of a god, maybe he's going to lift you out of your poverty. You pray to Zeus in a storm, and if you survive, you etch your gratitude in stone because you don't want him to forget the next time, right? Everything came with strings attached. By the way, in Thessalonica, when Paul rolled in, there was no moral obligation in any of these religions. Ethics, how to live, those were things philosophers debated. Priests didn't talk about ethics. They didn't talk about how you lived. Dionysus, the god of wine, he was honored in statues with grapes in his hair and an empty cup in his hand. And in one poem, he visited a man in a dream and mocked him for drinking only water, right? No ethics. Aphrodite herself, she was the patroness of prostitutes. And one ship was funded entirely by brothel prophets. And there were pornographic images in statues that filled the city, and they all became cult objects. This is what Paul rolled into. I'm going to pull this off the page. Thessalonica's faith wasn't just grand temples and rituals. It was trees that you didn't cut down because a sun god might be watching. It was astrologers telling fortunes. A man might raise a glass because he didn't want the stars to predict his early death. Spirits filled the air, worshipers of Dionysus. They joined funeral guilds. Others gathered for meals in honor of Zeus, who Thessalonica and a lot of the archaeological record called the highest god. These religious associations, all of them offered belonging and identity and community, especially in a cosmopolitan city like Thessalonica. This is what Paul sees when he gets there. We have a brief record of what happened when he arrived. This is from Acts chapter 17, the first 3 verses. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. His whole message was that there was one God, and you don't need to work for his approval. That was his message. That's the gospel. Paul later wrote, when he had left this city, he wrote to the Thessalonians, and this is what he said in chapter 1 of 1 Thessalonians. For we know, brothers, loved by God, that he's chosen you because our gospel came to you not only in word, but in power and in the Holy Spirit with full conviction. You know what kind of men we prove to be among you for your sake. In other words, Paul showed up, shared the gospel in a pluralistic world, in a pluralistic city called Thessalonica. 20 different gods. And yet in that city, the gospel took root. The story of Jesus stared down a city full of the most heinous actions and disastrous pagan stories and was seen as the only real thing. And God took this mangy, dirty servant named Paul, who had traveled the world, and he used this man to share the gospel of Jesus in this city. God enables believers to share the gospel in the most hostile of environments with means beyond your personal capabilities. Pluralism doesn't scare God. Let's travel back to Acts chapter 4 for a minute. Here's the context, right? Peter and John have been arrested. They've been released. The early church is experiencing some pushback. It's their first recorded persecution. In fact, Peter and John were arrested for healing somebody. And after their release, the believers gathered together and they prayed. And here's their prayer. Listen to this prayer. Lord, this is Acts chapter 4. Take note of their threats. And grant that your bondservants may speak your word with all boldness while you extend your hand to heal. And signs and wonders take place through the name of your holy servant Jesus. They asked for two things here, for boldness and for opportunity. They didn't ask God to cancel those who hated them. They didn't ask for an escape. They prayed for courage to stay in the game. And they prayed to keep helping. And we see that in Acts chapter 17. By the way, Thessalonica wasn't the only pluralistic city where the gospel took hold. Later in Acts chapter 19, we talked about this. Paul's in the city of Ephesus. It's the Las Vegas of the ancient world, glittered with temples, power, home of the massive temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the world. And Paul spoke the gospel in the synagogue. He received a mixed reception. But he didn't rage. He didn't retreat. He relocated. He went down the street to a lecture hall of Tyrannus, and he taught there for 2 years. And let me tell you how he did it, because this is how you share the gospel in a pluralistic world. He did it patiently and relationally. And in Acts chapter 19, verse 10, Luke said that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord. This is where we find our template to share Jesus in his own world. It's an investment of time. Paul did it, invested 2 years worth of time. In fact, we have the names of those in whom he invested while he was in Ephesus. It's found, there's a list of them. They're found in Acts chapter 19. I'm going to list them to you. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. These guys were in Ephesus. They sat at the feet of Paul in a pluralistic city, some of them from Thessalonica, and they lived and breathed the gospel surrounded by images of pagan gods. They were invited to festivals that honored these gods and these evil ways, and yet they didn't go. Paul shared the gospel with them. He shared Jesus in his own words, in his own world, over and over and over. He became their friends, and now we know who they are. Because of those guys, all of Asia heard the gospel. People found Jesus in spite of a world that wished they wouldn't. You probably heard of Rosaria Butterfield. We've talked about her. She tells a story of her conversion in her book, The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert. Rosaria was a tenured professor at Syracuse University. She was a leader in feminist thought. And she was a lesbian who saw Christians, in her words, as bad thinkers with good haircuts. She wrote an op-ed critiquing the religious right, and a pastor named Ken Smith wrote her a letter. It was a kind letter, asked her some questions. They developed a relationship, and he eventually opened his home to her. And he and his wife invested in her, not just once, but again and again. No debate, no pressure, just presence, just time. This is what she wrote in her book. Ken and his wife, Floyd, didn't share the gospel with me right away. They simply came into my world. They let me question them. They let me watch them. And slowly I began to wonder not whether they were right, but whether this Jesus they followed was really who they said he was. And through dinners and dialogue and hundreds of small, unseen kindnesses, Rosaria came to believe in Jesus. That story happened in a pluralistic America. But what about the rest of the world? What about other religions? Well, let me take you to Mongolia. A young woman named Inksarul she walked a path laid out for her by her family for centuries. She was 24 years old, and her life was woven into the fabric of her family's Buddhist faith. Buddhism wasn't just a religion, it was the rhythm of her days. It was the tether to her ancestors. It was the lens through which she saw the world. But in 2018, there was a Christian gathering in her small community, her small village. And she joined, or at least visited, this gathering out of curiosity. And there was a missionary there. And he gave her a New Testament. As she opened it later, she half expected some dry dogma, but instead she found the Gospel of John. And there in the words of Jesus, plain and piercing, she read, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And she read it over and over, and she read more, and she found out more about Jesus in his own words, in his own world. And she found in Jesus an invitation, personal and direct, to be known by a God who loved first. And this is what she said later. This was different. Buddhism taught me to navigate suffering, to let it go, but Jesus stepped into it and carried it and offered me a love that didn't ask me to perfect myself first. And for months, she wrestled, she read, she questioned, she sat in the back pew of that modest little gathering, and she watched people who believed in Jesus. And a year later, in 2019, she knelt in that church and was baptized. And she was the first in her family to claim this new faith in Jesus. Listen, Jesus' own words in his own world, it's a match made in heaven, y'all. Because Jesus is unique. He is necessary. He is God's one and only Son who recognizes our sin and removes it and gives us hope. That's the gospel, y'all, and it's worth celebrating.